The Finnish Communist Revolution, 1918.
6. The Red Guard. The working-class guards were initially created for numerous different reasons. When the Russian Tsar was overthrown, the Russian police in Finland was also dismantled. Finland had no police force of its own, and for this reason a so-called People's Militia was created to serve as a police force. The militia was an officially recognized government organ, but it was very different in composition from a typical capitalist police. First of all, many police officers who had served under the Tsar were seen as unreliable or treasonous, either by the government itself or by the population, and were thus not allowed into the militia, or were later kicked out due to public protest. The purging of the Tsarists from the police force allowed new people to get in. The militia was thrown together very quickly and spontaneously to fill the need for a police force, and these factors allowed for a very large working-class representation in it. In some places, which did not have a militia, the workers themselves created outright proletarian militias. Quote, "At first, workers played an important role in the people's militia. Later, the workers' role in the militias decreased due to opposition from the bourgeoisie and the Senate. The militia did not become an organ loyal to the bourgeoisie. In order to guard the interests of its members, it even utilized such familiar working-class methods as strikes." Unquote. The militia sometimes served as a basis for the future Red Guards. The biggest reason Red Guards were created was to keep order during strikes and protests, especially to protect workers from White Guards, who tried to smash strikes or to bring in strike breakers. The parliamentary strategy had failed, and therefore workers resorted more and more to direct actions, like demonstrations and surrounding government buildings, demanding concessions from the government. In these conflicts, the White Guard tried to rescue the capitalist politicians, and the Red Guard tried to protect the demonstrators. At that point, the Red Guards were still unarmed. Historians Suodenjoki and Peltola explain. Quote, "Workers had created Red Guards and order-keeping forces already in the spring of 1917. The worker guards, similarly to White Guards, were not originally intended for war, but for local purposes. The worker guards were a credible voluntary force for keeping order in localities where such force did not exist. During the year 1917, guards were created in conjunction with strikes and other conflicts, but even then their purpose was clearly self-defense. The Social Democratic Party was originally not involved in creating guards. Until the end of the summer, the majority of party leadership more likely opposed the creation of guards in their attempt to minimize the spread of unrest. However, more guards were created during the summer, and radical revolutionism increased, which forced the party to reconsider the situation. The party had to try to gain control of the guards, which were being created regardless. Since the beginning of September, party organizations began taking a more active part in the creation of worker guards." Unquote. Quote, "The October 1917 Congress of the Finnish Trade Union Federation, which discussed the food crisis, had a big impact on the creation of worker guards. A delegate from Tampere declared that if nothing else works, the food situation must be solved by creating a workers' dictatorship. Other delegates voiced similar opinions. As a result of the meeting, the Finnish Trade Union Federation sent a demand to the Finnish government on 20th of October, which called for the trade and distribution of food to be handed entirely to the state. It also demanded price controls for food, prices to be set reasonably low to meet the buying power of the consumers, as well as increasing food production and importing. The Trade Union Federation leadership encouraged workers to create order-keeping guards, quote, for self-defense and to prepare for any possible situation." Unquote. The message from the Trade Union Federation was also accepted by the Social Democrat Party Executive Committee. This was the first time the leadership of the working class movement publicly encouraged the workers to create Red Guards." Unquote. Quote, "The reason behind encouraging the creation of worker guards was the worsening food shortage. The working class movement demanded more effective methods from the government to combat the shortage, and prepared for general strike, in case the food question could not be solved satisfactorily. The trade union federation's sharply worded message activated the workers significantly. Guards were formed in many places where they didn't previously exist, with the exception of strike watch forces and other minor order-keeping forces. In Pirkanmaa, near Tampere, by the end of October, Red Guard organizations existed in at least 17 municipalities, and at the start of the general strike on 14th of December, there were guards in at least 28 municipalities, that is, in 4 out of every 5 municipalities in Pirkanmaa. In Tampere, a local order-keeping force, which functioned based on when it was needed, had already been created following the February Revolution. In May, a more regular militia force of the workers' organizations of Tampere was created, which still remained non-military in character. When the party began observing and guiding the creation of Red Guards, it got the name Working People's Organization Guard of Tampere. The Guard structure was formed by trade union chapters. Members were recruited from the best men of the local chapters." Unquote. Quote, "In the rules adopted for worker guard organizations on October 23rd, their mission was defined as protecting the rights of workers. It was felt that workers needed guards for their safety, since the bourgeoisie was creating its own white guard forces to safeguard its interests. In some municipalities of Pirkanmaa, creation of worker guard organizations was clearly a reaction to the bourgeoisie creating white guards. For example, in Orivesi and Hämeenkyrö, the workers explained the reason they needed a red guard force was due to the presence of the white guard. It's worth noting that in 2 out of 3 of the municipalities in Pirkanmaa, the white guard was certainly formed before the worker guard." Unquote. The People's Militia was merged with the Red Guard in many places, beginning with the December 1917 general strike. An order from the Red Guard leadership read, quote, "Keeping order is one of the duties of the workers' guards. The workers' militia will join the guard." Unquote. A number of different stages can be seen in Red Guard formation. 1. The public militia as a police force. 2. Creation of a purely proletarian militia or a proletarian police force. 3. Creation of Red Guards for local self-defense and for protection of local strikes and local demonstrations. 4. The party and trade union federation getting involved and guards being formed nationwide in an essentially coordinated way. And 5. The Red Guards finally form into a military force. Quote, "In many places, the guards were created by local worker societies. Social democratic municipal organizations also often served as founders. Trade union chapters did this rarely because they were strongest in large cities where guards were already formed earlier. Passivity of trade union chapters is also explained by the fact that municipal organizations and worker societies were the highest local organs. They naturally took responsibility for creating guard organizations. In some cases, other types of worker organizations also created guards. Selection of applicants to the guard was often done in meetings of worker organizations. All volunteers were not necessarily accepted." Unquote. Quote, "According to the rules of workers' order-keeping guards, only organized workers were to be accepted as members. This happened naturally, as recruits were chosen by worker societies and trade union chapters from their own members. The rules also required that recruits had to be, quote-unquote, class-conscious, knowledgeable about social democratic methods, and otherwise trustworthy comrades." Unquote. Organization and structure of the Finnish Red Army. It's worth pointing out that the Finnish communists only considered the Red Guard to be a rudiment of an army. They didn't think that the Red Guards ever became a real army, but only a volunteer militia. But in any case, to distinguish the Red Guard as a military organization from its earlier non-military stage, I will call it the Finnish Red Army. A military history website explains the organization of the Finnish Red Army as follows. Quote, "Organization used by Finnish Red Guards was basically borrowed from the battalions of the army of the Finnish Grand Duchy. which existed previously to the year 1900. Red Guard organization also included battalion, division levels, but in reality its companies fought as independent companies, not as battalions or regiments. In reality, the size of Red Guard companies varied between 70 to 150 men." Unquote. The typical structure was given as the following. A Red Guard rifle company was led by a company commander and a commissar directly below him. The company was divided into 4 platoons, each led by a platoon leader, with 2 rifle squads of a dozen men under him. The structure for a machine gun company is given as the following. A company commander and a commissar, with 3 machine gun platoons under them, 4 machine guns per platoon. The full army structure was the following. 4 companies formed a battalion, 4 battalions a regiment, 2 regiments a brigade, and 2 brigades a division. However, the Red Guard typically fought as separate companies of several hundred soldiers, or sometimes as battalions of thousands of soldiers or even more, but coordinating operations larger than this was practically never done. The larger units served merely as a command structure and for moving troops around, but had no significance in battle. Historians corroborate this information as roughly being true, but there were local differences. One historian says, quote, "The most important basic military unit was a company, whose strength was 110 men. The company was divided into 4 platoons, and each platoon consisted of 27 men. However, in reality, many companies did not follow these quantities, but were lacking. Local units in the rural areas could vary from a few men to hundreds in size. On top of that, there were special companies, for example, machine gun, flying, and artillery companies." Unquote. Quote, "The strength of the Guard in Tampere in late 1917 was apparently around a couple thousand. It included 3 actual battalions and a short-handed railway workers battalion, which were all organized into a regiment a little before the general strike of December 1917. On top of that, a few special units were formed in connection with the Tampere Guard, such as an espionage and intelligence unit, an orchestra, and an ambulance unit. Around October to December, a Workers' Order-Keeping Guards women's organization was created for the Guard's medical care, which tried to recruit members, for example, through newspaper notices. In the surrounding municipalities, at least in Virrat, the Guard included a women's organization." Unquote. In Helsinki, the Red Guard also formed several so-called naval companies from sailors, quote, "for the purpose of acquiring ships for the use of the Red Guard and for coastal defense." Unquote. In practice, squads of about a dozen men formed platoons, which formed companies of around 100 or 200 soldiers. Companies formed battalions, which could be almost 1,000 soldiers. They in turn formed regiments of thousands. Capitalist historian Anthony Upton writes, quote, "On paper, the organization of the Red Guard looked like that of a normal army. The men were enlisted in companies of 96 men, 4 of these formed a battalion, and 4 battalions a regiment. Thus, Helsinki Red Guard began as 2 regiments in January, and then added 3 more by the end of March. Viipuri raised 131 companies, all based on workplaces or villages, which formed 9 regiments. Tampere, Turku, and Lahti all raised regiments. But the regiments and the battalions were administrative and record-keeping structures. The fighting unit was the company. Only on rare occasions is a battalion found operating as a fighting force. The Red Guard was therefore an army that consisted of hundreds of largely self-governing companies of very uneven quality and size, and any effective operational orders had to be directed to the company level." Unquote. Quote, "A genuinely comradely spirit did exist, a sense of loyalty to mates, to class, and to the cause, which held the Red Guard together in the absence of the usual military sanctions, but it was not always enough." Unquote. The Red Guard army was under the leadership of the Workers' Executive Committee, the highest revolutionary authority. The Red Guard had a national general staff, regional staff, and local staffs. The general staff near front lines were called front staff. Quote, "In many places, guard staff was created already weeks before the class war. They carried out various administrative tasks. Though it had been originally planned that they would serve some kind of militaristic functions, their real work turned out completely differently. The original guard staffs became sort of civilian bureaus, committees, and for military purposes new committees emerged, the front staffs." Unquote. The regional front staffs commanded entire army groups, and although the structure fluctuated all the time, there were 3 army groups and basically 3 main fronts. So-called Northern Front near Tampere, Central Front around Savonia, and Eastern Front around Karelia. Quote, "Front staffs were chosen by heads of detachments choosing a leader, and 1 or 2 assistant leaders, a commander of artillery, commander of machine guns, reconnaissance, food and housing, etc. Front commanders were appointed by the National General Staff." Unquote. A Red Guard on the Central Front explained their command structure as follows. Quote, "The front staff divided its work in the following way. A. War Department. B. Finance Department. C. Munitions Committee. D. Medical Department. The War Department was split into 4 parts. 1. Leadership made assault and defense plans, troop movements and maneuvers with the commander. 2. The equipment officer handled acquiring ammunition and other war materials and delivering them to the front. 3. The cartographer prepared battle maps. 4. Rapporteur was tasked to gather reports arriving from different fronts and to unite them to a coherent whole, as well as prepare and deliver all messages from the War Department." Unquote. A Red Guard on the Eastern Front said, quote, "The leaders were elected in mass meetings of soldiers, all the way up to the highest commanders, and commanders were changed quite often." Unquote. Local command was typically 5 or 6 people, about half chosen by party organizations and half by the soldiers. Quote, "According to rules, the local guard leadership consisted of a 5-member executive committee. 3 members were chosen by the local worker organization delegate assembly, a Soviet, Social Democratic Municipal Organization, or Worker Society, while the Red Guard members chose 2. In many municipalities, the local guard leadership was chosen in this way, but not nearly everywhere. For example, in Tampere, the leadership, which was referred to as Central Command, included 6 members. 3 had been chosen by the municipal organization, 3 by the guard members. This was done to ensure the guard members had equal influence with the municipal organization. According to the guard's rules, officers were elected by the members. This reflected the guard's character as originally a non-military organization. Familiar methods from the working class movement were adopted into their work." Unquote. A massive book about the Civil War by the Finnish Ministry of Education states, quote, "The Red Guards organization already existed before the outbreak of war. At the top, there was the National General Staff, and under it, regional and local staffs." Unquote. That was the original situation. However, as we saw from other sources, to handle actual fighting, separate front general staffs were established. The book by the Finnish Ministry of Education further states that, quote, "The organization of the top military leadership only properly got going in March when the strategic position of the Reds was already weakening," unquote. And, quote, "Separation of civilian and military administration advocated was completed only as late as the 20th of March, after it had been prepared for over a month," unquote. This only goes to show the challenges the Reds faced, because they were relatively less prepared for the war than the Whites, and were amateurs in military matters. The apparatus of the Red State consisted of amateurs, average workers and peasants, not professional bureaucrats. Their military was really a paramilitary, based on volunteers with no training. As a result, the structure and methods of the Red Guard varied from place to place. There was a lot of confusion about which institution should do what. Oftentimes, military organizations like the Red Guard were forced to carry out purely civilian tasks,
and even in military matters they acted in very non-military ways. They elected their officers, shared power between Red Guards and civilian organizations, and in many ways behaved exactly like trade union organizations with guns, rather than a professional army. Quote, "The term staff is rather misleading because of its military connotations, since most of these committees had nothing to do with military operations, but were concerned with organization and record-keeping at the rear. They were responsible for internal security, which involved organizing guards and patrols, and making searches and arrests, but these quasi-military functions were really police duties. The civilian character of most staffs was reflected in their membership, which tended to consist of the older party members, and the mountains of paper that they have left behind them show that they were mainly occupied in calculating pay, distributing food and clothing, arranging accommodation, and issuing endless permits and certificates. The term staff was also misleading because these bodies did not see themselves as the source of executive authority, but as delegate bodies, elected by and responsible to the mass membership, so that all major decisions had to be referred to general meetings. When companies were brought together for operations, the commanders and their staffs would elect delegates to form a front staff, which actually directed military operations." Unquote.
Now let's take a look at the composition of the Red Army. Quote, "The Red Guard consisted of workers and the rural poor. It naturally did not include any bank directors, large landowners, shop owners, etc. 65.63%, or 2/3 of Reds who fell in battle, were workers and farm laborers. With house servants and temp workers included, the number is 77.96%. Among whites who fell in battle, there were only 17% workers, but there were 45.38 land-owning peasants. The White Army also included other members of the wealthier classes, employers, etc. Among Reds who fell in battle, only 5.36% owned their own plot of land." Unquote. Soldier material on the Red side was, from a military and class standpoints, undoubtedly more homogeneous than on the white side, and there was enough of it voluntarily available. The working population of cities and industrial centers, including its skilled sections, who, because of the influence of the working class movement, had become used to solid organization and discipline, was ready to step voluntarily into the ranks of the Red Guard. The agricultural workers and tenant farmers were also voluntarily on the side of the Reds. The Red military leadership, on the other hand, could not even be compared to the white leadership. After all, military training had not been available in Finland for decades. Learning to use even basic weapons took time, and there were no teachers. The Reds had only one officer at their disposal, Russian officer Colonel Svechnikov. The Red military leadership practically developed entirely during battle. The number of soldiers in Red Guards rose up to 20 to 30,000 during the beginning of the Civil War. Initially, there were insufficient weapons. Enough weapons could be given to frontline troops only after fighting had already begun. The exact number of fighters in the Red Guard is not known. At its peak, the number was around 70 to 80,000. While the white forces had already been organized into a typical military structure, and a hierarchy had been created down to local divisions and squads by the time the battles begun, the Red Guards, on the other hand, were born out of the members of workplaces or workers' organizations. Thus, companies could form from the workers of some workplace, or some organization would form its own company. Well known were, for example, the company of the Jyry Working Class Sports Club. Rural workers' associations formed their own Red Guard detachments, and often those in the same municipality would form a detachment. This was a natural starting point for the founding of a voluntary class army. Its advantage was the sense of tightly knit unity in the detachments. After all, everyone knew each other. Leaders were chosen from those people who already enjoyed the men's trust based on their previous activities. On the other hand, when creating larger army units, and when troops were moved away from their homes, the local nature of the units hindered their utilization for broader tasks. The defense of one's own home was seen as more important. Oftentimes people waited for instructions from the command at their home municipality, etc. But as the battles went on, the Red Guards formed a comparably solid foundation for a united army. Military experience was learned in practice, and the officer corps also grew, so that in a few months, the Finnish workers' Red Guard could already successfully perform even difficult tasks." Unquote. Why did people join the Red Guard?
The working class and poor peasantry of Finland joined the Red Guards to fight for their rights. The capitalist government was not willing to grant the workers' demands, and instead had escalated the situation towards civil war. The workers had only two options: to fight for a better future, or to surrender and live in misery. The old propaganda narrative of the capitalists was that people supposedly only joined the Reds due to communist agitation. However, this has proven to be a lie. The people lived in terrible poverty, had a real threat of starvation, and had no political rights. They knew these facts from their own lives, not from the mouths of communist agitators. After these lies were debunked, liberal capitalist historians have tried to look for real answers to the question why the workers joined the Red Guards. Let's look at the answers they provide. One historian from 1998 writes the following, quote, "In the entire country, the economic situation was bad, unemployment was high, and there was a shortage of food. Poverty and unemployment forced many to consider joining the Red Guard. In interrogations after the war, when the winning capitalist side asked the prisoners reasons for joining, this explanation was emphasized. After all, it was a neutral reason for joining. For this reason, the significance of unemployment for joining was surely exaggerated." Unquote. He concludes that economic conditions were indeed terrible, people lived in poverty, and there wasn't enough food. But he also admits that when questioned by whites, the workers and peasants naturally would not want to admit to being socialists. They would much rather give politically neutral reasons. Of course, the two questions are interconnected. The workers supported socialism precisely because life in capitalism was so bad for them. But while they could admit that their poverty was bad, admitting that they were socialists usually would have led to their deaths. So, poverty and unemployment were the most commonly given reasons. Quote, "I was forced by poverty," unquote. Quote, "I joined for bread," unquote. Quote, "I joined since there were no jobs or food," unquote. However, it seems clear workers also did not make the decision to join the Red Guards simply as individuals. They had a sense of community. Though joining the Red Guards was not mandatory, and indeed only organized workers were even allowed to join, still there probably was some type of peer pressure. Many workers considered it simply obvious to join the Red Guards. For instance, when interrogated, Palonen stated, quote, "I joined because everyone else joined," unquote. Sulberg stated, quote, "There was no particular reason for joining, it was just the general opinion that everyone belonged to the Red Guard," unquote. Vilén testified, quote, "Joined because others joined too, and it was said there were no jobs beside the Red Guard," unquote. Nyberg testified, quote, "I joined because people looked at you funny if you didn't join, and because work was stopped at the factory," unquote. Quote, "However, many reasons became intertwined, and a person makes the decision often without even understanding all the factors. Economic, ideological, psychological, or physical pressures blend together," unquote. Another worker testified, quote, "While working as a carpenter in the cement factory shipyard, on 5th of February, 4 armed men showed up and said all organized workers had to come to the workers' club, and others joined the guard as soldiers. Admits joining was partially voluntary and partially necessitated by economic reasons," unquote. Quote, "There weren't many Red Guards who openly spoke about their ideological views when interrogated by whites after the war. One testified, quote, saw the guards function as keeping order and wanted to help," unquote. Another one testified, quote, "joined to improve workers' conditions by his own initiative," unquote. And a third testified, quote, joined due to a sense of duty and opinion, unquote, which are all basically euphemisms for joining for ideological reasons. Quote, at the outbreak of war, the membership of the Red Guard was selectively chosen and in principle voluntary. Membership was only open to members of workers' organizations, unquote. Another liberal historian writes,
quote, in a factory town like Nokia, it was almost impossible for a factory worker to not join the Red Guard. The work community had a strong social pressure. Joining the Guard did not mean taking a strong political stance. Instead, it was normal to join together with everyone else. Due to its large factories and strong workers' organizations, it was possible in Nokia to recruit large amounts of people to the Guard. Recruiting happened largely from trade union chapters. Almost all of the Guard members of Nokia were factory workers or other workers. On top of ideology, especially unemployed people might join because of the wage paid to Red Guard members, unquote. Quote, in the treason trials after the war, ex-Guard members understandably didn't want to admit joining to the Guard voluntarily for ideological reasons. The accused rather justified joining with economic motives. By joining the Guard, one could get help in surviving the economic difficulties, unemployment and food shortage. Guard members were given a good 15-mark daily wage, a meal, and support for their family. This must have impacted at least the youth and unemployed membership.
Quote, although the Red Guard was both a voluntary and a selective force, and would enlist only organized workers, the initial enthusiasm produced an ample flow of recruits. Recruitment was usually a group decision by a trade union branch or the village workers' organization, so that many early Red Guard units were simply identified by the trade or workplace of the members. Unquote. Quote, to the Finnish workers, whose womenfolk commonly labored with them in the factory and field, it came naturally to recruit women as well. Women sometimes formed a significant proportion of the membership, as in Tampere, where there were 901 women against 5,094 men, and some of them got into the firing line to the horror and disgust of the whites. Unquote.
Unlike the whites, the Red government never had a policy of conscription or forcing people to join the Red Guard. This is another example of the Social Democrats' commitment to only pursue policies democratically, legally, and based on voluntary action. The whites increased their army from around 10 to 20,000 to around 70 and 80,000 through forced conscription. The Reds built a largely volunteer army of the same size, 80,000. With conscription, they could have outnumbered the whites. However, the Reds never took firm action to implement conscription. Quote, the population fleeing from the municipality of Virrat intensified after the outbreak of the war, when the whites implemented conscription. The amount of people avoiding the draft was highest in Virtainkylä, 123 men, 107 in Toisvesi and 83 in Vaskivesi. Tens of people fleeing from Virrat would go on to fight in the Virrat Company, which included a total of 300 Reds from Virrat. 1/4 of the Guard members didn't belong to workers' associations at all. Reason for joining seems to have been to avoid being conscripted by the whites. Unquote. Near the end of the war, it was becoming clear that the whites had gained the upper hand. This prompted the Red government to take stronger actions. The extent of this was still not conscription. The government only ordered those people who had voluntarily joined the Red Guard and then left to rejoin. There were individual cases of local Reds pressuring others to join, but this was never a policy. The Reds also considered a plan to recruit those working in unemployment relief jobs to the Red Guard, but this was never done except by the city of Tampere during the siege and encirclement. Kuusinen later criticized the Red government policy for not making it mandatory for unemployed people, and especially capitalists, intellectuals, and members of the non-working classes, to join work programs. There should have been an all-out responsibility for everyone not serving in the Red Guard to work in order to support the war effort. This wasn't done. Instead, capitalists and aristocrats were often left to sit inside their homes, and in several cases they conducted spying activity on behalf of the whites. Quote, For example, the property owner Arvo Mattila from southern Teisko provided information to the whites. He wired his telephone to the telephone line between Kuru and southern Teisko and listened to the Reds' telephone conversations in his house." Unquote. The Red Guard had a reconnaissance division, but there was no secret police or intelligence service to combat spies. The Russian Bolsheviks and Ukrainian anarchists had a secret police to combat spying and sabotage, but the Finnish Reds didn't realize the necessity of such a thing.
Upton says, quote, "The Red government was almost unique among revolutionary governments in never establishing its own political or secret police." Unquote.
In general, the Red Guard's activities were characterized by extremely anti-authoritarian policies and measures to the point of detriment. Quote, "Altogether, in the first weeks of the war, 150 White Guards were arrested in the city of Tampere, but in most cases they were simply let go. The city's Red Guard was mainly concerned with confiscating weapons." Unquote. Spying and counter-espionage. The Reds did not have a secret police, but let's discuss the type of reconnaissance and counter-espionage that they actually did have. A Red Guard author writes, quote, "There were two types of reconnaissance divisions, one frontline and the other so-called local divisions. Tampere had both of these. One was called the Northern Front Spy Department, which practiced frontline espionage on the enemy side, and the other was the Tampere Intelligence Department. Before the actual battles, they were tasked with keeping an eye on the enemy's movements and combat preparations, trying to find out their weapons depots and secret training places, generally to find out what is going on among the counter-revolutionaries. The department also arrested individuals from whom weapons were found or who otherwise acted as counter-revolutionaries. After general mobilization, the duties of the intelligence department also expanded to include operations throughout the Northwest. In this area it had the right to conduct home inspections, confiscations and arrests. These measures were assisted by local Red Guards, and all the captured whites and other criminals were transported to Tampere, where the intelligence department carried out a preliminary investigation. The resulting protocols were to be sent to the Revolutionary Court, which finally convicted or acquitted the accused. Indeed, in several cases, the verdict was acquittal, even for persons who would have deserved nothing more than to stand in front of a line of rifles. Often, the sentences were such as to be banned from leaving the area and ordered to report to the intelligence department office, some every day, some once a week. Afterwards, it seems ridiculous that such sentences were given during a revolution, but that is how it was. Those people were thus given full freedom to continue to act as counter-revolutionaries, and this leniency was also one of the factors in our defeat. As far as Tampere was concerned, only 2 death sentences were given, and the people in question were in the Red Guard. One was the commander of the Ikallinen front, Seppälä, who was accused of selling out his troops. It was proved that he had received 40,000 marks for organizing his troops in such a way that the whites had a favorable opportunity to attack. The other was named Anton. He was an interpreter for the front staff of the Northern Front and an enemy agent. He passed all the information he received from the staff to the whites." Unquote. British capitalist historian Upton writes, quote, "The possibility of repression was much reduced because the Red regime had no political or security police. Red security measures were simply incompetent. White politician Louhivuori, who was hiding in a hospital as a patient, was able to go into town accompanied by a nurse and conferred with Svinhuvud on 3 separate occasions. He remembered a house in view of the hospital and of the Red Guard checkpoint outside, which had a stream of young visitors carrying violin cases. Quote, one could observe that what they were carrying was extremely heavy." Unquote. In fact, they were smuggling arms into a White Guard magazine and strongpoint. The whites made brilliant use of telephone monitoring, using friendly telephone staff. The most vulnerable point in white security was the domestic servants, on whom they were wholly dependent. There must have been significant numbers of disaffected servants who could have been used to monitor what went on in bourgeois households,
but no effort was made to tap this obvious source. In these conditions, the white resistance could operate with some impunity. The medical profession abused its immunity to conceal fugitives or provide safe transport in ambulances or under the escort of medical personnel. The foreign consuls, who were usually native businessmen, used their consular status in partisan fashion to claim diplomatic immunity for their premises and communications. The Viborg Red Guard pointed out that the Belgian, Italian, and Norwegian consuls were all leading officials in the White Guard, but they were told to leave them alone. The Workers' Information Bulletin was justified in claiming on 15th of April that the consular corps had persistently abused their immunities to help the government's enemies. The Swedish embassy did the same." Unquote.
Engels criticized the Paris Commune for being too lax and too soft. The same criticism can be made of the Finnish Red Guard. The white senators managed to escape from Helsinki to the new white capital of Vaasa. Bourgeois politicians were not arrested like they should have been. White Guard Senator Talas stated in his memoirs that, quote, "If the Reds had been bolder, they probably could have gotten all the bourgeois senators arrested. Arresting the government could have caused the war to end completely differently. Without the help of the white government of Vaasa, it is doubtful if Mannerheim could have inspired support among the population of the north, which was needed to defeat the Reds. The Reds would naturally have called Mannerheim's action a revolt against the lawful government by a general coming from Russia. As Mannerheim was still unknown to the Finnish people, such talk could have influenced at least part of the population." Unquote. Quote, "Leaders of the bourgeois groups in the parliament were also not isolated or arrested, but they were able to carry out counter-revolutionary activities. They published appeals to the Finnish people and attacked the revolution as an unheard-of act of violence. This helped to direct and organize counter-revolutionary forces." Unquote.
Svinhuvud, the leader of the white government, was trapped inside Red Helsinki, but was able to escape. Quote, "The rescue of Svinhuvud showed how damaging the hostility of bourgeois experts and technicians, whether Finnish or Russian, could be. Bourgeois officers, sea captains, navigators, engineers, telephonists and telegraphists, doctors and nurses had to be employed if society was to continue, but none of them could be trusted to be neutral at moments of crisis. Only severe repression could have overcome this menace to the security of the Red regime, and it was not prepared to adopt such methods." Unquote. All talk about the Red government being a supposed totalitarian dictatorship is nonsense. It was far more lenient and less authoritarian than the white government, which was attempting to build either military dictatorship or monarchy, and which outlawed the Communist Party and most other leftist organizations during its rule after the war. The Red government was democratic, reformist and soft, to a degree which hampered the success of the revolution. Even British capitalist historian Upton, despite being confused about many other things, says quite correctly that the Red government, quote, "in dividing over whether to maintain the closure of the bourgeois press, showed that they had not fully grasped that they were presiding over a war in which there could be no question of allowing enemy newspapers to be published." Unquote. Quote, "They did not see the fact that revolution is an act of violence. They did not see that war, the fact that blood had been shed, shifted the political conflict onto a qualitatively new level." Unquote. Quote, "In the heat of a civil war, these men, who were principled atheists, came near to the Christian ideal of loving their enemies. It was a sentiment that their Christian opponents certainly did not reciprocate. Political realists will question their wisdom, and they had failed lamentably to grasp what was needed if the revolution was to be carried to a successful conclusion. If their precepts were followed, the revolution was certainly doomed to political and military defeat, but its moral superiority over the victors would be incontestable." Unquote. Quote, "The mildness with which the whites were treated did not go unnoticed, and some Reds thought it scandalous. They could see the class enemy apparently leading a comfortable, carefree existence, while workers suffered and died for the cause. A report from the front on the mood among the Red Guard troops described their bitterness because, quote, 'the enemy is pampered and protected, and prisoners offered conditions which the men at the front do not even dream of, unquote. The men were saying that when they got back, quote, we will first of all clear up the rear of Mensheviks who play at revolution and the more dangerous butchers, unquote. On 4th of March, a meeting of Red Guard commanders in Helsinki demanded that white prisoners should get no better food and conditions than the Red Guard on active service, and there were press comments on the crowds of idle bourgeois haunting the streets and restaurants. The Labor Department commissioned a report on the problem that was forwarded to the deputation for consideration on 9th of March. The simple proposition was put forward that the bourgeois would have less time to make mischief if they were put to work, and it recommended the government to, quote, bring into force a duty to work because of counter-revolutionary sabotage, unquote. The idea was that anyone without a certificate of useful employment would be deprived of his ration card. Quote, the plan is also humane, there is no trace of compulsion in it, everything is voluntary, unquote. This was true in that anyone would be free not to work if he was prepared to do without food. The deputation approved the idea in principle, but it looks as though the problems of implementation prevented it being put into effect, unquote. In conclusion, the Reds were obviously novices in military matters. They had learned to work largely under peaceful reformist conditions and to not engage the capitalist class in violent clashes. The Red leadership had up till now accepted the dogma of the Second International that socialism could not be built in a less developed country like Finland until the large industrial powers like Germany became socialist. Therefore, the Finnish Red leaders had never seriously prepared for revolution in Finland. When the situation began moving towards a revolutionary crisis, they tried to avoid it. However, as the masses moved further and further left, so did many of the leaders. And when the revolutionary situation was forced upon the Red leaders, most of them accepted the inevitability of revolution and the responsibility of leading it. They did not betray the workers. However, they were not well equipped to lead. Due to their softness and incompetence, they often resorted to basically anarchistic tactics, although not because they were committed to anarchism, quite the contrary. Instead, it was merely because they lacked the necessary skills to do anything else. They lacked the skills to create solid revolutionary organization, discipline, leadership, and decisiveness. Those are skills which they did not originally have and needed to learn. They were not real revolutionaries, had no experience of revolution, and did not understand revolutionary theory. The revolution would have to be their teacher. They would have to learn from the revolution and from the masses. They had also not carried out the necessary preparations for the revolution. That is why they so seriously lacked weapons and did not have a well-oiled military organization ready when civil war broke out, while the White Guard had been making decisive preparations and was already armed and ready for war. Since the task had not been completed in advance, the Red Guard would have to be made into an army during the Civil War. The inexperience and theoretical backwardness of the leaders made this a difficult and slow process, but it was being done. We shouldn't be too hard on the leaders. They did not ask to be in that situation. Many times they offered to resign if better leaders could be found, but there were no other leaders. The working-class vanguard does not simply fall from the sky, but is built and trained over the course of time, together with the masses. Their task was difficult but not impossible. The Reds had certain advantages, and their defeat was far from inevitable. The Whites could not sustain a long war, because they controlled no production centers, and their troops were farmers who would try to abandon them en masse by the time spring sowing came around. The crucial factor ended up being Germany. The Whites were able to focus their forces, while the German invaders stabbed the Reds in the back. The only way for the Whites to achieve a quick victory was with Germany, though if Finland had had a Bolshevik party, they would probably have already taken power in the December 1917 general strike, and the Civil War might never have happened. We have now analyzed the Finnish struggle for independence, the conditions of the working class and the peasantry before the revolution, the 1917 December general strike, the White War preparations, and creation of the Red Guard. In the next installment, we will finally begin analyzing the details of the revolution and civil war.